So tell me, first of all, George, why did you start up Students for Western Civilization?
So the main impetus for Students for Western Civilization is I went to York University. I majored in psychology and political science. The number one thing that stood out to me about my university experience was in so many classes, especially liberal arts classes, especially sociology, anthropology, political science, was this constant theme, this constant narrative in every class about how white people are oppressors and everyone else is the oppressed. White people are especially and uniquely evil, how all white people are racists, only white people can be racist, that multicultural Canada is actually a white supremacist country, that white people invented the concept of race as part of a conspiracy to oppress and enslave the rest of humanity and to divide the working class. And this whole experience of going to university made me very conscious of my ethnic identity as a white person, or the term I prefer is European. And so SWC was created for other people who are experiencing, this same phenomenon and want to be able to get together and critically study and critically explore and examine the ideas that were being taught to us in class. Because my feeling was that what was happening in the class was not really a thorough critical examination of these issues. The problem with the term racist is that it's a loaded term. And to remind ourselves, a loaded term is any term which comes carrying extra baggage of implying something more than what is objectively there. So the term racist comes loaded with negative connotation. And I see that term as a form of oppression, a weapon of social control that people use, especially on people of European descent. It's a way of saying that it's bad of us or immoral of us to do what's good for us, and that we're only good boys and girls if we subordinate our interests to the interests of other peoples.
But you're in Canada. This is a multicultural state. So I'm wondering what you think about the policy of multiculturalism and its effect on European identity in this country.
So this is a fascinating topic. This is a fascinating question. These are the questions that our generation should be exploring and should be asking. And that's part of why SWC exists, is to have this difficult conversation and this fascinating conversation. So multiculturalism is a very unique policy, and it's a very recent policy. Only a very small minority of countries in the world have adopted this policy. Canada was the first country in the world to adopt this policy. This policy was undemocratically imposed on us. There was no vote. There was no referendum. We were never asked, and we never agreed. The government will constantly tell us that multiculturalism is a part of our identity, and it's a part of what it means to be Canadian. But to that I say, says who? Like, not us. We never agreed to that idea. And polls have shown that the majority of Canadians actually don't even support this policy. So multiculturalism is the idea so whereas classical liberalism, an element of classical liberalism is the idea of the separation of church and state, multiculturalism is the extension of that thinking, of that theory, to cultures. Multiculturalism is the separation of nation and state. It's a way of, in order to mitigate or manage inter-ethnic conflict, the policy was the theory was to say, instead of saying that this space or this country belongs to someone in particular, the way a traditional nation state does. For example, Japan belongs to the Japanese people. The idea of multiculturalism is to say, okay, this space belongs to no one in particular, and that way no other minority groups are marginalized within this space. It's a fascinating topic, but I think it deserves to be scrutinized in a way that hasn't happened.
Now, we've seen movements in recent weeks and months and indeed years of this sort of erosion and erasure of our culture, whether it be prime ministers off of our banknotes, our founding father of Confederation off of our public schools, his statues being, defaced and what have you. Do you think that this is leading to a sort of erasing of our ethnicity, of our European heritage? And if so, is the word ethnocide something you can get behind, or do you think it goes too far?
So, ethnocide is the deliberate destruction of the culture of a people. The United Nations has the concept of cultural genocide, which is the same concept as ethnocide. The term ethnocide was originally floated, and that they would maybe use that term, but they ended up saying, we're not going to use that term, we're just going to call ethnocide cultural genocide. I think ethnocide is a more appropriate term, because using the term genocide to refer to cultural destruction, to me, it comes across as disingenuous. If I were to say that we Europeans in Canada are experiencing a genocide, I think people would go, if people find out that, there's no piles of bodies, they would feel like I'm misleading them. But ethnocide, I think, is an appropriate term. It follows from the policy of multiculturalism that if this space belongs to everyone, then it shouldn't reflect one group of people more than other groups. And so these movements to tear down the cultural symbols of European Canadians, the nation state with whom Canada was once formally aligned, it follows from the policy of multiculturalism to make the common space culturally neutral and culturally equal. So that's a topic I'm interested in, is the relationship between multiculturalization and the destruction of European Canadian culture and civilization.
Now, one of the places that we're seeing this take place most in is inside our university classrooms, where it's no secret that neo-Marxist, cultural Marxists basically, rule their little fiefdoms over there. So my question to you is, multiculturalism is something we might hear at the governmental level, but inside the classroom we're hearing things like critical race theory, decolonization. Talk to me about how that sort of line of thinking works in tandem with multiculturalism, and is the effect the same, namely ethnocide?
So this is one of the things that inspired my interest in these topics while I was in university. So critical race theory is a school of thought, a school of study, which begins with the assumption that evil white people invented the concept of race, and that there really is no biological basis for the idea of race. And white people thereby invented racism and cut the world up into races in order to create a power hierarchy between groups that puts Europeans at the top and other peoples at lower levels of the hierarchy. And so critical race theorists say that racism, they use the term racism very differently than the rest of the people who speak English. When they say racism, they don't mean, to them racism is more than just the thoughts and actions of individuals. Racism is an entire systemic phenomenon that manifests as the system of white supremacy. So, and again, the term white supremacy they use differently than everyone else as well. When they say white supremacy, what they really mean is supremacy in the sense of cultural supremacy. So they'd say that, for example, Canada is a white supremacist country, in the sense that Western culture or European culture or white people's culture is dominant here. Canada is, in a societal sense, an extension of Western civilization. And because European culture, Western culture is dominant within this space, it is in that sense they'd say this is actually a white supremacist country. And in their eyes, that's a moral wrong. In their eyes, our cultural, societal, political existence is itself racist and is white supremacy. And so they aspire to dismantle and deconstruct the system of white supremacy, which is what everyone else would just call white or Western civilization. And so one of the terms they use is the idea of decolonization. To decolonize this space means to remove the European expressions of European cultural identity. And so there's this parallel between multiculturalism and the decolonization movement, in that they both, I think they begin with a different theoretical basis, but they both conclude with this idea that we should carve out European cultural symbols from spaces like Canada. Our mere cultural political existence is white supremacy. And so for people who use the term white supremacist in that way, if our mere cultural, societal existence is the problem, then it's like, well, what is the solution to the problem? If our existence is your oppression, then doesn't it logically follow that the solution to your oppression is our non-existence? And if that's the case, then again, it sounds to my ears like people who use the term in this way. Another example is Black Lives Matter Toronto a few months ago called Justin Trudeau a white supremacist. So yeah, people who use the term in this way, when you see it written online, you see someone calling someone a white supremacist, think to yourself, like, what do they actually mean? Is this one of those examples of people who are using the term white supremacist in this way? If white supremacist means the mere cultural presence or existence of European peoples in Canada, then that term applies to, at the very least, to most social conservatives in Canada, if not the vast majority of European Canadians, if not the majority of citizens in Canada who hope to see Western civilization exist here.
Now, on the topic of statues, while they're erasing and trying to knock down and defacing all of these European ones, do you think that this is going to result in basically a lack of symbols across this country, or do you think that there's a double standard that's now forming and we're seeing the erection of new other cultural symbols now being transplanted and put into our country here in Canada?
So I feel that the theory of multiculturalism ultimately isn't even really applicable. It's not achievable. It's not a physical possibility. In the sense that how can you actually have a space that is culturally neutral to all peoples? What language would we speak in that space? So we can destroy all these symbols of Western civilization, but then what are you going to replace it with that's going to resolve this problem of cultural oppression? If we're surrounded by European sculptures and European culture and we speak a European language, there is truth. I mean, as a nationalist, I agree with this neo-Marxist understanding of power. In a sense, I agree with this idea that the existence of something within a space necessarily involves the exclusion of other things from that same space. So if you were to remove these European symbols and then replace it with something, you haven't solved the problem of oppression. You've just changed the question of who is being oppressed, who is the dominant and who is the subordinate, who is the winner and who is the loser. So it's not like one option of someone else's culture or our culture is the more moral option or the more righteous. Inevitably, someone's going to be dominant. We're going to speak English or maybe Chinese or some other language, but there's going to be no societal format which is equally applicable to all peoples. See, these are interesting questions. Like, these are worthy of exploration and study. These are the questions we should be asking.
And these are uncomfortable conversations. They are, but I want to thank you very much for taking the initiative based on your own life experience and having it with people in a healthy, a normal, a thoughtful and rational way. It's really, really refreshing. Perfect. Thanks so much, George. I appreciate it.